Hello, everyone. Welcome to Who Governs the Wikimedia Movement session. We have Nicole and Ava from Wikimedia Deutschland. Nikki is supposed to be around, but she's not here with us. But I'll give the floor to Nicole and Eva to introduce themselves. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Irina, and hi everyone. I'm Nicole Ever, Director of Movement Strategy and Global Relations at Wikimedia Deutschland, and I'm here with my team member Eva Martin, who will also take over the mic in a second. And Nikki would be with us, as Irina said, but she's traveling today and can't join, but of course sends greetings to everyone. And now we are looking forward to speaking with you about who governs the Wikimedia movement and explore a little bit why we probably all should care about this. And now I'm handing over to Eva.
Hi, everybody. We are really happy to be having this discussion with you today. This session will be happening in English, but you can also participate in French. Je suis d'origine française et je serai très heureuse de lire et traduire vos questions en français si vous préférez parler en français. I already told you I'm French, Nicole is German. We both work at Wikimedia Germany. We would love to know who is joining us today. So if you feel like, please just write in the chat where you're located right now. I'm already seeing some people from Uganda. Hi, Chris. Uganda again. Hi, Irina. Hi. Hi, Nicole. Okay, this is really nice. Thank you. So let's start with the second warm-up question. We are going to talk about movement governance today. And we would like you to think of one situation, one decision that affected your work and your community. It can be related to fundraising, can be related to technologies, any kind of policies. Please just think of it. And if you come up with something, please just write it in the chat. Let me introduce the agenda for today. So firstly, we will introduce the governance structure of our movement today. And based on this, we will see that there is a need for change, and we will discuss the possible scenarios for the future of our movement. Then we will look at the opportunities of the movement charter drafting process. And finally, we will have an open discussion with you. So please share your thought, your opinion. We are really eager to discuss this with all of you. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Nicole.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, Eva. And please keep on sharing your stories if you come up with some. We thought that this is like probably a nice experiment for everyone to think about, hey, what kind of decisions have been made that I probably have been affected by, but have not had such a huge chance to also participate in the decision making. Before we dive into what's going to happen in the future in our movement and how we can potentially influence this, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we actually get there, how our movement has historically grown. And I mean, it all started with the idea and then a project, Wikipedia, and then other projects and communities, of course, but a US nonprofit organization, and then, of course, this diverse and global network of communities and affiliates. There are, of course, all these governance structures in each of the projects. And when I say projects, I mean, for example, English Wikipedia, French Wikipedia, Wikidata, and all the others. And of course, these have grown the editing communities. And these communities have, of course, also organized themselves. And on the other hand, there are the organizations or affiliates or groups who are more or less formally governed, depending on the legal form of those affiliates. And also, of course, the cultural and geographic context, because most of the chapters, like, for example, also Wikimedia Deutschland, we are all membership organizations with the General Assembly that then elects the board, and the General Assembly being basically the highest decision-making body. And then there's, of course, the Wikimedia Deutschland, currently at the center of everything, and being organized as a US nonprofit organization. And now I've talked a little bit how all these separate entities are governed, but how actually is the movement governed? How do we come to decisions that affect like every one of us globally, be it the communities or the organizations? And in the last decade or so, we have some global advisory or decision-making bodies in place, such as, for example, the Affiliations Committee, the FDC, which is the Funds Dissemination Committee, and of course, the Board of Trustees of the Wikimedia Foundation. And recently, for example, one other body has been introduced, which is the Regional Committees for Grant Making. They have been established to consult on funding decisions of the Wikimedia Foundation. Next slide, please. And I want to tap a little bit into the challenges that come with these structures, because is this structure that has organically grown in our movement still adequate in today's world and today's needs? A world, for example, in which we strive to be a really global movement with equitable decision-making, and especially also one movement that doesn't replicate colonial or imperialistic power dynamics, or a world in which everyone may join and can expect really to be heard and considered. Or and a world in which local communities are able to make their own decisions about what they work on and how they want to allocate their resources, for example. So these challenges, how do we create equity, representation, and local leadership across our movement? We think that the existing structures that we have described, they don't meet those requirements yet. They probably haven't grown or matured like this movement in the same way as the world around us and the needs that we actually have. So we actually think that this has to change, and that emerging communities that have been left out because of structures of power and privilege need to be also more at the center, and that we need to focus our efforts on them. And that is some language from the strategic direction, the 2030 strategic direction that has been developed in 2017, and that the strategy recommendations and principles have been built upon. Next slide, please. And yes, that's what I just meant. So we have a strategy which has been released in May 2020. So it's over a year old already, and we are now knee deep into how can we actually implement it? How do we make it happen? And how do we bring those principles and recommendations of our movement to life? And this strategy should lead us towards the growing and expanding our movement by 2030. And to be honest, 2030, it's only 9 years away. So we need to get going. And now you can move to the next slide, Eva, thank you. And what I will say is that, the recommendations and principles, it's a lot of text and it's very long, but I really recommend, if you haven't, look at it and read it and be inspired by it and imagine the change that they can bring. And they've really focused a lot on, or if you want to summarize it a little bit, it's all about subsidiarity and equity. And one part of it is subsidiarity in decision making. That would mean that decisions should always be made by those who are mostly affected by them, or as close to those who are affected by them. And that means the local communities. You will ideally be able in the future to make decisions about how you want to work, who do you want to work with, and how do you also want to get organized in your community. Next slide, please. And how can we make that work? This subsidiarity, and one model that has been discussed in our movement, it has been where we have been seeing a lot of energy is around are the regional and thematic hubs. And these are like new structures that should help you build your strength at the local level and also gain new functions. So they should enable collaboration across borders so that we're not only working with our local peers, but really support each other, create synergies also around funding and advocacy, for example. And then there's the other like pillar, you could say, like is that equity in decision making. And that means that there's really democratic representation and participation in decisions that affect the whole movement as a whole and also its parts, so its organizations, communities, and projects. And when it comes to those decisions that affect the whole movement, we need to come to good solutions as a movement, because at the moment we struggle with representative and global decision making. And that is also like the vehicle that has been described in the movement strategy recommendations, like a global body, a global like council, for example, that where each and every like organization and community in the movement can elect someone or someone who will then represent them. Especially when big decisions are being made about money, about policies or technologies and so on. That's also closing the loop to our question from the beginning of that meeting, that yes, in the future, like what decisions would a global body make that you also feel represented by? Next slide, please. And yeah, the big and overarching question for us is really like, how do we get there? How do we make that work? What does it mean? What do we have to discuss, establish, let go of, do differently? And we have developed two scenarios for the future. That's what we call them. We've been thinking about how could our governance look like in the future and be reformed. And when I say we in this regard, so that's that's what Wikimedia Deutschland has developed. We've been thinking and hearing so many conversations about this the future of that global council and so on. So what does it actually mean and how could it look like? And we want to present those two scenarios so that we can have a discussion on a more informed level and so on. Really look at what are the potentially two different ways. But of course, I think there are many ways like in between or different scenarios. And we want to initiate those conversations to fuel the conversations. We think that those scenarios that we have developed, they are basically very fundamentally different, like 1 and 2, they are both very different. But in both scenarios, we will have a global body that will be representative. And when I say representative, I mean representative of the communities, the affiliates, probably also the regions, the projects, of course, also the Wikimedia foundations and the communities. And they would all have a membership structure. I just saw Ayla's comment in the chat. Hello, Ayla, good to see you. So yeah, I'm going to quickly talk a little bit about those two scenarios, and we can dive into that in a second as well. But let me first try to describe them a little bit on a high level. So scenario 1 would be a global council that gives advice to the Wikimedia Foundation. So that would mean the current structures basically stay in place, and the Global Council becomes an advisory body to the WMF Board of Trustees. And that would mean, for example, that every time that there are movement-wide decisions to be made, this council is consulted and their recommendations are considered before the WMF then makes the actual decision. And scenario 2 would be quite different from that. where the Global Council would basically be a global assembly that makes important decisions, that makes the decisions and not only consults on them, and creates an international non-governmental organization. So the WMF remains the WMF, and we gather a global assembly which over time takes over the decision-making. And this assembly would then be the highest decision-making body of our movement. So completely different from what it is now. And we can imagine that our scenarios also describe that if you create such an assembly, they also need to be supported, like, for example, by staff or a secretariat, or staff and a secretariat who takes on all the administrative work, and that different jobs for the movement will have to be, for example, reassigned from different affiliates and the foundation to that international NGO. And that could, for example, be in grant making, or also what else was it? Like grant making, funding, and other things. And we also think that, of course, a lot of the jobs will remain with the existing structures. So with the WMF, for example, hosting the servers and trademarks and endowment and so on. So it's not about creating everything from the start and so on, but really building upon the current and existing things that actually work quite well. And what I also wanted to say is that I can see this as a development path. So scenario 1 can lead to scenario 2. So we start with this advisory body that will then at a time, after some time, develop into a global assembly and so on. But I think we need to be a little bit clear about this from the beginning. That when the MCDC, Movement Charter Drafting Committee, exactly, starts working on the charter, they would kind of need to know what kind of model this charter is going to be describing. And I will also say that scenario 2, this is not something that we just came up with or newly invented or is a radical model, but this is how the majority of other international NGOs are also governed, like Amnesty, Doctors Without Borders, Greenpeace, not WMF, WWF, what's it called? Yeah, sorry, and WWF and so on. And yes, this is also, which I think is not such a surprise, but how many of our chapters are governed. As I said, many of the chapters and organizations are governed by their members and by their General Assembly. Next slide, please. And I'm also happy to hear your questions and comments, but maybe I'll finish that presentation first. So we wanted to make it a little bit more simplified. That is why we also came up with this graphic. So this is what the future could actually look like. So it would then, for example, the Wikimedia Foundation would not be in such a center role, but the focus will be on all the entities, like communities, affiliates, WMF, and we would be organized through the hubs, for example, and then represented by that global council, where we basically all have a voice in. Next slide, please. And as I already said, the drafting of the movement charter is the first step of this governance reform that is happening now. And this process will be, of course, designed in a transparent and participatory manner. And I would super love to encourage you speak up in this process, because it's like so mega important that all the different voices are being heard, and that this committee also hears the voices that are probably not the loudest and not those that like contribute in every process, but really find a way to also listen to people that have not been making their voices heard. And I want to quote from the recommendation number 4, which is equity in this ensure equity in decision making, that this says exactly, we will establish a global council representative of the movement in its role and composition, and it will be composed of elected and selected members, and in a way designed to reflect the diversity of participation, not only in the movement at present, but also in the communities that we wish to serve. And the responsibilities of that body will be outlined in the charter. And this charter is about to be drafted. And this process is going to start quite soon, and it will take some time because all the different negotiations about what kind of future governance model do we want to see, how can we make sure that all voices are heard, but that, again, these new bodies are actually also able to make decisions and able to be run in an effective way. And so it will be quite a tough job, I think, for the Movement Charter Committee. And again, please make your voices heard. And we will, of course, also join different community consultations and so on, and talk about the subsidiarity and equity pillars or values. So what decisions should be made by the communities, which by affiliates, and which by regional hubs? That is, I think, still a very important question. So how can you distribute that in a good way? And then, of course, which decisions will remain with the WMF, and what role will the future hubs probably play in them? And the same goes also for equity. And how can we ensure this equity? Is it by creating a global body that is an advisory council, or more of a governing assembly that will all have to be in that charter? And then also, how is membership constituted? I mean, you could, for example, say every affiliate sends one representative into that global council, but how will the projects do it then? How will the hubs be represented, and so on? And yes, so there are like super many topics and details that, and some of them will go into the charter, and others will probably also go in extra policies and agreements. So we also need to be careful that the charter is not, I don't know, doesn't want to cover every single detail of our future. And I think, Eva, you can go to the next slide. We would love to hear from you. What do you think of all of this? Does that like resonate with you? What are your biggest like fears? Do you already have something? I mean, I don't know if anyone of the MCDC Movement Charter Drafting Committee is in this session, so maybe they can also say something about it. But yeah, we would like to especially hear from the African communities and affiliates how they, I mean, first of all, how do you feel represented in the movement right now? And what do you think could change in the future? What scenarios would you like to see? And I'm going to stop my monologue now. And we brought a couple of other questions with us, but I first wanted to give you the chance to speak.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for this really great presentation and overview you gave us. I see that the number of participants kept on increasing during the session. We are now 17 people here. I am sure there is a lot of wisdom in this group. Please, as Nicole said, feel free to just raise your hand, come on the stage with us, and share your opinion. And we would also be happy to just hear what kind of work you're doing in your community project. And maybe you don't really know yet how all this discussion on movement governance influence your work. Maybe we can discuss it also freely.
I think for us in Uganda, it has been the question, or in East Africa anyway, it's the hubs. It's the discussion about the hubs. Should we do a region or something? And that's the discussion that's going around more than the other aspects of the strategy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This is really interesting. And I mean, the idea of building hub is actually part of the strategy, because as we said, it could be a really great vehicle to actually ensure more equity in the decision making and more decentralization in our movement. So maybe you could also tell us a bit about your motivation for building a hub.
I think our motivation has been that we do have similar kind of projects and similar kinds of motivations to work, and we're all working in our own silos, and we find that collaboratively we bring in more numbers and more improvement and more synergy, if that makes sense. Yeah, so I think the collaborative thing is because we are the same, like we're doing the same things, so working together makes sense.
Of course. Yeah, sharing resources. I'm
Yeah.
reading now in the chat. Isla said, surely the hubs can be operational once the charter is finalized. So obviously we see a lot of energy in the movement around this idea of hubs, which we all find great, but there is no official stated yet of what hubs are and how should they be funded in the future, for instance, and so on. And this is something that could be specified by the movement charter that is being written now, or the process is starting. So even if hubs might be the main focus for the African communities, actually having a say in the ongoing drafting of the charter would also help you share your ideas on how you would like hubs to be in the future for them to really support the communities.
I see Isla had a question. I've invited her on stage.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you on the screen. I just wanted to, and I came in slightly late, so I'm sorry if you've already probably done this, but I know that obviously it's a very consultative process, even though there is a committee that's working on developing the charter. And I wondered maybe if, as there was through the whole movement strategy and the recommendations, when are communities required to feedback? And I wondered if that had already been set, just so that people are prepared and it's not kind of just dumped on people, because I think there's so much feedback going back and forth at the moment, and I think that was my question.
Thanks for that question, Isla, and lovely to see you as well. Maybe just to make that super clear, we've given this presentation from Wikimedia Deutschland's perspective on how a potential global council and movement governance structure could look like. And I'm the people responsible for setting up the movement charter drafting process and so on are, of course, the foundation teams, and they would probably have a better answer or a more clear and direct answer to the timeline. But from what I know and assume, the timeline is, so the group is currently forming, the Movement Charter Drafting Committee is forming, and as you probably also remember from the working groups, that group forming alone will take some time. They need to be onboarded, that need to all get on the same page of what's actually at stake and what this charter could entail. So I don't think there are any time frames currently where exactly consultations will happen. But I will also say, we have this thing called Meta, where people can already post ideas and thoughts. And we will, for example, we wanted to gather some input on those two scenarios, and are also planning to put those two scenarios then on Meta, so that there is some information that the committee can already take in. And I'm sure there will be many calls and online processes, and we are also trying, this is also something that we are discussing in a group from different affiliates. Can we be inspired by how other movements do participatory governance writing? Because we always try to do the wiki way, and it often hurts a lot, as you also remember probably from previous processes. So what can we learn probably from other like nonprofits and communities and movements? How do they write their governance documents in a participatory way? Yeah, I'm complete. And okay, maybe I have one other comment, because Ayla, you also asked about the hubs. I also think, because the hubs is something that is really like emerging like naturally, and everyone's putting a lot of energy in there, I would actually encourage everyone, like, not wait until everything is like written and set in stone, but try things out already. Like, if you think, okay, this hub, we need to hire a person to do this and that, or this hub needs, I don't know, a logo, or I don't know, like, some of the operations could already be started and funded, because there are also these implementation grants that the foundation is giving out, so that others also can learn from the experiences that the hubbers have made. So I would just not wait, but do and see what works and what doesn't. Hubbers, yeah. Thanks, Ayla.
Thank you, Nicole. I think for me, my other insight into, let's say, African communities, this whole strategy thing sometimes is a bit much to take in or munch in. We have fairly new users. Let's just say Wikindaba had almost 50% first-time users, So when they come into a session like this, it's almost like, what are you talking about, So with African communities, we're still facing an issue of, what is strategy? Like, what are you talking about? Like, people have not internalized it, and I feel there needs to be a continued sense of sensitization, and because we had that whole year where we embarked on it, and and sometimes now we speak with an assumption of people know what we are saying, or they know where it came from. So if I'm a newbie in this session and it's my first time I'm hearing about Wikimedia and I wanted to join and I'm on the continent, like, guide me through this process. Like, where do I start to understand it?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's one of the biggest issues for this whole process, also probably for the movement, because you feel this in a lot of the topics, and when new people come in and they really wonder, what, I don't even understand a word, what are you talking about? And how can we do this? How can we improve this? Like, offer strategy one-on-ones, or I don't know, regular onboarding sessions through all time zones and all languages, where I think it needs to go like a little bit in a like peer support way. So it shouldn't be, I don't know, the like foundation or Wikimedia Deutschland or whoever to talk about this, but maybe in a peer-to-peer or mentorship relationship. I don't know, I'm just making these things up, but I really wonder how we can improve this, because I know that I'm doing the same mistakes there over and over again. And when I start talking about it, I basically forget to make it more accessible. So if you have an idea, Eva, I see you've unmuted, so maybe you already have a better idea.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Irina, for raising this question. I think it's quite central to our presentation and to the whole topic. I don't know if I have an idea about how to change this. I can just share my personal opinion. I'm also quite new in the whole Wikimedia movement, and I also at first struggled with the whole strategy. And what I came to realize is that the strategy is actually not something from the top. being added to all the other things that are already being really important in the work of the community. But the strategy is actually trying to just offer solutions to the problems that the people on the ground are facing every day. So to take an example, for instance, newbies being new on Wikipedia and wanting to edit an article might find it hard to know how to edit, to know how to interact with the other people, to know who is making decisions, how are decisions being made, and so on and so on. And the strategy is actually trying to answer those questions and to offer possible ways in the future to address them. So what I like to say, talking about strategy, is it's not something on the top coming and adding more troubles to your life, but it's actually a guideline to how to solve those issues. But I mean, this stays quite theoretical, and maybe we should also work on some onboarding workshops where we would really start with the basics. And that's the reason why we also try to open this session with this question of trying to relate this whole topic of movement strategy to the life of the users by asking, can you please think of a decision that was being made by the movement that actually had an impact on you? So I think it helps relate. But I also understand that if people are really newbie, it might be hard for them to actually identify what were those decisions being made where I did not have a say that actually impacted my life. So I think it is also interesting that people maybe did not react because they maybe are not in the state where they can identify this. And this is a problem. This already shows that there is a problem in our movement governance today that we need to change.
Thank you, Eva.
So is there any other question or comment or anything really? We are really open for everything, even for the newbies. Even if you just want to ask, what are you talking about? I did not understand the word. Please feel free to say it. That's the moment.
And we've also brought these two slides where we closer describe the two models. I'm not sure if that makes sense to show them here. It would be interesting if someone is interested in that, like we have like drawn how these two scenarios could look in the future. We could show it, but I would like to probably understand a little bit if this would be useful for people or better not.
Okay, Irina is interested, so I'm going to do it.
Excellent.
As you share, I see there's a question from Akanmu. Can there be a guide from Wikipedia that new volunteers can follow?
Yeah, is that some? I think, like, I don't know if that is a model that is used in other Wikipedias as well. But for example, in the German-speaking Wikipedia, there's this mentor model where people can sign up to be a mentor, and then new community members, new editors can like basically pick one of the mentors to be their mentees, and they basically take them by the hand and help them to create their first article, or help them to find sources, or help them to understand how the inner workings of the communities work. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's something that is also used in other projects. I know that there has been this project of a tea house, I think in the English Wikipedia, where new people could like come in and ask questions and be also like taken by the hand a little bit and onboarded.
Maybe you could also tell us, what would you like what would you like to be part of this guideline? So maybe there are some elements that you would like to be included in this mentorship program or this guideline, as you said. Can you maybe tell us what would you like to include in this, or what are the topics that should be discussed?
Oh, I'm trying to invite the user on stage,
Mhm.
but I can't invite them to stage because they're using mobile. So we'll wait for their feedback in chat then.
Okay. Because from what I know from those mentoring program, it's quite based on how to edit, which is also a really important part of the group, of the work of the communities. But maybe it would also make sense to include something of movement strategy. And maybe there could be an onboarding chapter based on how do I make my voice heard in the whole movement, not just in my project. This could be something.
I think for me, when I think of the mentor issue, is the actual mentors, are they there? Okay, like the time, but then maybe I'm talking about me who has kids, a job, and but I like the idea, especially if there are people out there who would want to mentor. I'm thinking of the time factor, but I guess if someone is available, they can do it.
Maybe this is something that could be included to the hubs project. Because as you said, hubs are supposed to be here to help people put their resources in common. Because what you've mentioned, people are working, they have families, they have limited time. That's true. That's a real reality we need to work with. And maybe hubs could also work on this mentorship program.
I do feel mentorship may have to be beyond hubs because, for example, if someone is available in Germany and I'm not available, we should be able to get people in touch. And those experiences actually do make a difference and help people get a bigger perspective, when you do talk to other people in other regions or in other groups. So for me, when I look at mentorship, it would have to cut across hubs, like whoever is available, even if it's not in your hub. That's how I would think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. This definitely makes sense.
The other thing that has resonated through the conference is the Universal Code of Conduct. We had something in the pre-conference, and they're having consultations, and they have some sort of timeline. Is that the charter or the Universal Code of Conduct? It's the same thing. You could correct me. And there's a sense of if that's ready, then we can then go on to the next steps. So it feels like it's a first step for everything else. I don't know. You could tell us.
Maybe Nicole wants to say something on this.
Yeah, I can try, because yes, it's all complex and complicated. So the Universal Code of Conduct is basically the guidelines for behavior in not only on the Wikimedia project, but also in everything that Wikimedians do in terms of going to events, be it online or offline, personal interactions with everyone that now will fall under the Universal Code of Conduct. And that conduct has also, the policy has been written by by a committee of volunteers, and the policy text has been then ratified by the Board of Trustees. This is one of the decisions. Okay, the Board of Trustees has ratified it and said it's going to be, what's it called? It's going to apply to all Wikimedia projects and all Wikimedia organizations and events and communication and so on. And that has been a global, so we have actually been like thinking, maybe someone mentions Universal Code of Conduct, because that has been a global decision that has in the end been taken by the Board of Trustees. And that is now currently is being discussed, how will it be implemented? So if someone violates the Universal Code of Conduct, what will the sanctions probably be? And the sanctions will probably look different depending on the context and depending on the projects and events and so on. But that is the next step that this Universal Code of Conduct Drafting Committee is now pursuing, which is not related to the Charter. I think, in my understanding or my imagination or whatever of the Charter will have a sentence or something in it that that everyone needs to be treated with respect and all these things that, so maybe like 1 or 2 sentences as a summary of the Universal Code of Conduct, and then link to the actual policy and say that the actual guidelines will be linked as a policy under the Universal Code of Conduct, but it will not be part of the Global Movement Charter Drafting Committee process. I don't know. Was that even clear? So
Yeah.
two processes
it.
are separate.
Yeah, two different things. I get it. So you did get a message from Akanmu, where he says exactly what you said now, to get involved in other projects. So I guess he gets the feeling that if you get involved in other projects, it's mentorship, some sort of exposure. But I think there's also something you raised, and not to take away from, maybe let me check in the chat. Someone says guidelines on other wiki projects should be given. Yeah. But to raise something that you also talked about was the Board of Trustees. This happened and some things were taken up by the Board of Trustees. Could we know, out of the strategy process, aside from the Universal Code of Conduct, what was taken up by the Board of Trustees?
I'm not fully sure I get the question.
Because when we did make those recommendations of strategy, and this is for people maybe who are new, these recommendations came out of this process, and these recommendations were sent to the board or proposed to the board or presented to the board, and the board decided. So it's just to understand what decisions were made by the board after.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think, so as I said, the recommendations have been published in May last year. That was right at the beginning, basically, of the pandemic. And after that, we had there have been a lot of conversations happening in the movement, and conversations about hubs, for example, but there has not been a decision about hubs yet, for example. And I think the decisions that are now the most, from my perspective, the most important upcoming decisions are the responsibilities that the board will hand over to the Global Council, for example. That is also in the recommendation, ensure equity in decision-making, that over time, the board will direct some of the global decisions to a new body, a new council. And I think that those negotiations that unfortunately they were actually supposed to happen at the end of the recommendation drafting, but then got basically not outsourced, but it was then said, no, we are going to discuss that all in the implementation phase. And so I think this is from my understanding, if we really want to change our movement towards being more equitable and sustainable and towards subsidiarity and representation, then these are the important conversations that need to happen now, and where the board will have to make some decisions, because some of the decisions from the board of trustees of the foundation will then also be what kind of decisions do they hand over to different bodies, like also, for example, the hubs or the council.
Thank you, Nicole. Like every time you talk, I get another question. But I don't want to
Good.
talk too much because I want other people to ask. Yeah. So, guys, you please post questions in the chat, raise your hands, I'll add you on stage. So, you talked about implementation, and I think that's something that had not yet come out clearly in this talk, the fact that we are now in the implementation phase. And that's why we're seeing these discussions about universal code of conduct, or we had yesterday a nurse talking about how they would foresee regional hubs in their areas and actually making decisions of like, what can we do beyond this, beyond it just being like, oh, we would like it, but let's take some decisions on how we'd want to see it. And as a person who has been on the mailing lists, if I could say that, I do get lots of communication, or join this meeting, let us hear about this, let us hear about that. But if you could tell us implementation, where does it stand? If you could tell us the implementation efforts so that we know where to fit in.
Very good question. Because I think, we are in the midst of the implementation, and implementation can also mean different things. One aspect for me is the global implementation. So where do we need to come together as a movement and discuss things? And that is, for example, with the Charter or with the Universal Code of Conduct, because these things affect like all of us. But there are also recommendations that every single affiliate or community can look at and think about, how can I implement this? How can I adjust my annual plan towards, for example, I don't know, what kind of, like, increase sustainability of our movement, for example. How can I implement this in my annual planning, or ensure, no, what's it called? Identify topics for impact. Like when you work with like your communities and want to figure out, like, how can you figure out what is the content that matters most to people, and are there gaps? Are there knowledge gaps that could be filled? And then what kind of resources are needed to fill those gaps? And I think the foundation is offering a couple of grant models to actually go into these implementation efforts. And again, I think there's a lot of potential in the recommendations to really look at them and adjust your own work towards it. So it's basically from the really small into the really huge movement. So every single one of us can look at the recommendations and principles and live them, and the communities and organizations can strive towards making them happen. And then, of course, these global conversations happen. I think what is maybe a little bit disappointing is that we are not that far into the implementation as we would have probably loved to be. And that is partly because of the pandemic, and because, I don't know, we can't meet and we can't have those tough conversations. We can have them here, and that is, I love this software and this platform and seeing people. It's so amazing. It really gives us a feeling of being a movement, but still we are behind in the implementation efforts from my perspective, and hope that, we make use of the next, it's only 8.5 years to 2030. So let's do it.
Yeah, I like that you raised that issue about annual plans. And I know right now the cycle for, let's say, the general support grants has just ended. And you realize, just even going through the general support grant or applying for it, you interact with WMF staff and they guide you in certain things. But I think for me, what I realized, it was not what lacked, the issue of implementation to be tickled in people's minds and say, hey, as you think of your next plan, remember, these were the recommendations. Do you have a strategy within your communities? Do you have a way you would want to implement this in your communities? And then encourage communities in themselves to have their own strategies and direction on how they can implement it. And sometimes some communities are self-driving and they could have it, but some communities could be inward looking and they're looking at their own projects. So it would help when there's like, have you heard about this? That's what I would recommend, at least from WMF to the smaller communities.
Thank you a lot for all your questions. I found this discussion to be really interesting. I also wrote them down, and this is going to help us improve our presentation in the future. Maybe we can include some slides on what's the current state of the implementation, for instance. But I would like everybody to have the opportunity to give us some feedback so we can really improve our presentation in the future. And I've just sent now in the chat the link to a really short survey. We would be really happy if you could answer those questions and give us some feedback on today's session.
Thanks everyone for joining and sitting through this presentation on governance.
Yeah, thank you everyone. It was great having you.
Thank you guys. We can continue the discussion in the lounge as the session ends. We can continue the discussion in the